Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Maddie Bunting, and I am the Dean's Chief Student Ambassador at the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I will be serving as MC for today's online seminar with our special guest, Ms. Tara Haley, who will be discussing how to fight the global security threat of disinformation. The first half of our event will be devoted to a presentation by our guest speaker. We will then devote the last half to an audience Q&A. For that Q&A, I have also invited my fellow classmates to ask questions as part of a roundtable panel with our guests. Audience members, if you have any questions you would like to pose during the Q&A session, please do not send them via chat, but instead please use the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. You can submit your questions anytime throughout the event via the Q&A feature. You do not have to wait until the audience Q&A to do that. Now it is my honor to introduce our special guest. Tara Haley is a freelance science journalist who specializes in writing about vaccines, public health, disparities, misinformation, and medical research. Her work appears in the New York Times, National Geographic, NPR, Scientific American, Elemental, O Magazine, Texas Monthly, and elsewhere. She authored the Kirkus Star 2018 young adult nonfiction book, Vaccination Investigation, The History and Science of Vaccines, and frequently speaks on vaccine hesitancy, including a TEDx Oslo talk on why parents fear vaccines. She recently served on an NIH panel to develop COVID-19 vaccination communication recommendations. She co-wrote The Informed Parent, a science-based guide to the first 4 years with science journalist Emily Willingham, and authored a dozen children's science books. As a medical studies core topic leader for the Association of Healthcare Journalists, she creates resources and training for journalists reporting on medical research. Ms. Haley, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Great to be here. I am going to just jump right into it. So I'm going to share my screen here. And once I share the screen, you'll have to give me just a moment to get the slides set, since they won't let me look at it at the same time. So as you all know already, I will be talking about how to fight the global security threat of disinformation. And I will try to endeavor to be as optimistic as I can. That will make more sense soon. So we will jump right in. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and give myself a timer here so that I am paying attention to how long I'm talking for. There we go. So it's funny, I've got my Twitter handle there, but if you were to go to my Twitter right now, you'll find that it's protected. And that relates to these 3 numbers that I just added this slide literally after I logged in, because this slide relates to something that happened between when I completed this presentation last night and today. The first number, that 23%, that number refers to, in a recent poll, the number of Republicans who agree with the following: that the government, media, and financial worlds in the United States are controlled by a group of Satan-worshiping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation, that there is a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders, and finally, that because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. 23% of Republicans believe that, allegedly, according to this poll. And I'm going to discuss a little later whether we should believe that number or not. 14% is the number of Americans who believe that. That's approximately 1 in 7 Americans. So think about who lives on your street and 1 in 7. Now, you guys are in California. It's probably different than where I am here in Texas. I'll take care of all of your 1 in 7s over on my end. But that is not a small number. And then that last number, the 1463, that is the reason that my Twitter is protected right now, because 12 hours ago, I had less than 400 people blocked on Twitter. I currently have 1,463 people blocked on Twitter, and I blocked all of them in the last 12 hours. because I tweeted something. A particular conservative who didn't like what I had to say retweeted it and had a lot of followers. And so I have now lost about 4 or 5 hours of my time to blocking internet trolls. And that's going to become relevant a little bit later to public policy. That's not just a woe is me story. It's related to these other numbers because you can imagine the political affiliation of many of those trolls and the kinds of things that they had in their bios. So I just kind of want to use that to set the stage in terms of the threat that we're facing. But to get on with the talk, I'm going to provide sort of a problem solving framework. This is when I'm a journalist, when I'm thinking about problems, this is kind of what I go through. You know, what is the problem? What do we know about that problem? Like, what's the broader context and how do I understand it? What kinds of information do we have on it? Usually evidence-based information. And then what evidence-based solutions do we have to it, if they exist yet? Often we have a data gap there. Determine a plan, implement the plan, evaluate the plan and the execution of it. And then the most important part is not to stay stuck there, but to continue evaluating it with changing evidence and circumstances, which is often the most difficult part for both the people implementing the plan and the people following this from afar. But this is kind of how I'm going to approach this talk. So defining the terms initially, misinformation is pretty straightforward. It's just inaccurate information, right? Disinformation is intentionally inaccurate. It is designed to mislead, and it usually has some kind of agenda. Well, it always has some kind of agenda behind it. It's usually financial or political, although there are other ones like such as ideological. It is propaganda, but it is more than just propaganda, and not all propaganda is necessarily disinformation. And then conspiracy theories, we all know what those are. These, belief in some nefarious coordinated behavior to harm people. And obviously conspiracy theories are featured within disinformation and misinformation. So I pulled this off of First Draft. This goes through like 7 different types, and you could divide these up in different ways, but the satire or parody is kind of the one that is the least harmful, but can still harm, unfortunately, because I love The Onion. But we all know that there are people who cannot tell that something is satire or parody, and therefore it gets translated into something that people believe is real. Misleading content, imposter content, when they pretend, you've probably all seen websites that pretend to be, ABC, but it's not actually ABC. Fabricated information, just flat up lies. False connections, when the visuals or the captions don't support the content. This one's far more insidious than people realize, and its headlines in particular can be really problematic in this way. False context, when you have a fact, but it's couched within something that misleads you into what you think of what it's saying. And then obviously manipulated content. And this is where technology and deepfakes become really challenging and will continue to become so. So characteristics of conspiracy theories, most of these, again, you're going to know, but it's helpful to sort of think about them as a whole. They're driven by people, not facts, obviously. What's interesting, though, is that the facts contradict. People can believe in multiple conspiracy theories at the same time that contradict each other, that could not logically coexist, and yet they simultaneously believe them, which really emphasizes the cognitive dissonance that occurs there. Extreme skepticism or suspicion of official accounts, which makes it really hard to discuss sources, because any source that would be reliable is, by its own definition of reliability, suspicious. They always involve nefarious intent, the belief that the official account is intentionally misleading. And this is one that I think is interesting. The believer in a conspiracy theory is both the victim and the hero. And I don't know how, this is way before most of your times, but there was a movie called, oh gosh, now I don't remember what it was called. It was about, Mel Gibson was in it, and he is this conspiracy theorist, and he is simultaneously the hero of the movie, but also the persecuted victim who is most, at risk. And it's a very interesting dichotomy there. It's immune to evidence. This is the one that is so frustrating, because the more evidence that you provide that contradicts it, they incorporate that into evidence of how strong and robust the actual conspiracy is. So it is truly immune to evidence. And it overinterprets randomness or coincidence. I could tell you some incredible coincidences that have happened in my life that sound just unbelievable. If you want to hear some great ones, there's a fantastic This American Life episode on NPR that talks about coincidences. And it's really easy to get caught up in that can't be a coincidence, but there really are a lot of coincidences. And if you who have had math classes and statistics would know that. And this is where we start getting into what's the problem. Misinformation and disinformation has always been problematic, dating back to the Middle Ages when witches were, persecuted and killed, or the snake oil salesman on the corner who could harm people with the fake cures that he was selling. The problem now is the scale. There's a famous quote by Mark Twain, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's something to the effect of, a lie makes its way around the world 5 times before the truth has a chance to get its shoes on. And I was remarking, to a friend last night, how when Twain said that in the 1880s or 1890s or so, it was still true then, but now it is literally true. Like a lie can make its way around the globe online in a matter of seconds before a person who has the real information gets their shoes on, walks to their computer, opens their computer, and sees it. And it's really extraordinary to consider that. So why is it so dangerous? We know already about the mental health burden and disease outbreaks, and I have a comma there because I didn't finish that, because I was trying to think, how do you say all of physical health is endangered by misinformation and disinformation? It can inhibit action against climate change, which is by far one of the largest, if not the largest, existential threat to humanity today. But it also destabilizes democracy, and destabilizing a form of government. You guys have studied history, what the significance of that is. And I think that is the precursor to so much more, because, the climate change is going to kill us all eventually, probably. But before we get to that point, I worry, are we all going to kill ourselves? Because that information becomes so dangerous. It feels like we're watching a zombie movie sometimes. The cost, there was an economic analysis that came out last year that suggested the cost of disinformation and misinformation was $78 billion globally. That includes the cost by fake news and the cost to counter that news. I think that's almost certainly an underestimate. I'm not sure how, I haven't looked at all of the methodology on that, but I'm sure that's an underestimate. And it's only going to get worse. The speed of our technology, the reach of our social media, the sophistication, the fragmentation, the echo chambers. I don't need to spell all this out for you. You guys live it every day just as I do. An example of the economic impact, just the volatility in the market. We've all heard of Black Tuesday back in 1929 with the stock market crash, and we know how dangerous that was in setting off the Great Depression, among other factors. So imagine the power that, these are a couple of notable milestones when a piece of misinformation caused substantial volatility in the markets. So, that kind of information has that danger as well. So why do people believe misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories? What are the social conditions and what are the psychology of our own brains that sort of enable this and foster it? Because that's really important to understand this. So first, the attractions of misinformation and conspiracy theories. It provides answers, right? When we have times of uncertainty, which we've all been experiencing for the past year and a half, especially in the early part of 2020, we want answers. We feel unstable. We don't know what's going on. And we have these feelings of powerlessness, like we don't have any ability to control the trajectory of our life or what's happening around us. So conspiracy theories and often misinformation give us that sense of security. We feel like we now know what's happening. And that helps us cope psychologically with those threats. It explains unlikely events. Look at what we're seeing right now with discussion about where the coronavirus originated and whether it was a lab leak or whether it was some nefarious governmental conspiracy to release it as a bioweapon. That helps people. That's an easier way to think and understand than, a random series of events biologically that led to the evolution of a virus in bats, or that eventually made its way into humans. To dispute mainstream politics, especially among those who are disaffected, reinforce someone's cultural values or personal experiences, and our confirmation bias. I'll be talking a bit more about that in a bit. It makes people feel special. So it's not just that you have the answer, it's that you have the answer and nobody else does. And they don't believe you, but the secret knowledge. So not only does it give comfort, it gives a sense of specialness to you. What's important to note is that it doesn't require being paranoid, mentally ill, or narcissistic. You can be a normal, functioning, walking around, nice person and believe in conspiracy theories. And I've often been startled to discover after I knew someone for, 6 or 7 years, they would make an offhand comment about something, and I would be startled because I realized that a comment, I would look at, one time it was my cousin saying that obviously the 9/11 was an inside job, and I was like, what, wait, what, huh? So it's, it's not at all necessarily people who are, quote unquote crazy. So there are also things that help all of these conspiracy theories and misinformation flourish. First, the creators of disinformation, they have vested interests: financial, political, ideological. Sometimes it's just plain power. It's often financial, but they have vested interests. And so they're going to invest in perpetuating these. But there also can be a lack of, a vacuum of leadership. If there's not trust and clear, consistent messaging from authoritative figures and organizations and institutions, then something's going to move in to fill that vacuum. And often in recent years, the tyranny of the algorithm, which you may have heard before, and echo chambers, Google, Facebook, Twitter, they want us to keep coming back to their sites. And the way that they get us to keep coming back to their sites is they show us what they think we want to see based on what we've seen before. So the more we use those sites, the more it fine tunes what we see and we don't see outside that area, unless you make you have to make a conscientious, explicit effort to go outside. And that's not easy to do for many reasons: technological and psychological reasons and emotional reasons. Our brains are also wired to trust stories over facts. I have a whole talk where I discuss, where do we get our value system from as human beings? All of our values come from stories. Every single one, whether it's Aesop's fables or it's biblical stories or it's the Quran or it's ancient Hindu gods and goddesses, all of religion is stories. And before that, it was, sitting around the campfire in the caves. We pass down our values, our lessons, our own family history and identity through stories. And so stories are how our brains are literally wired to understand the world. That makes it much harder to break through them with a fact that might contradict that story. We also in-group and out-group differences are, I don't even have to explain that when we've seen that in plenty of, of obviousness over the past several years. People share stories based more on emotion than on facts. It's how you make it, how it makes you feel, right? When I went to go see the movie Armageddon, which now that I think about it, probably came out before most of you were born, and I'm going to pretend like I didn't realize that right now. That was a stupid movie. I actually spent most of the movie annoying the heck out of my date by saying, oh, this is what's going to happen next. Oh, wait, we're going to cut to this next, because it was that predictable. But you know what? I love that movie. It's so dumb and predictable, and it's so fun to watch, right? You know that Bruce Willis is going to give his life up for his daughter or something like that. Spoiler, sorry. I actually don't remember if he dies, but I know that it was a dumb movie, and I loved watching it because it was about emotion. It wasn't about whether it was actually a factual possibility, right? And then we have this media amplification of what's called the lizard man constant. This is an idea that was presented by a psychiatrist thinker who he blogs at Slate Codex or Star Slate Codex. I never say it right. And it's this idea that whenever you do polls, a certain percentage of the responses to those polls are always going to be outlandish, like utterly insane. An example was a poll that looked at how many people thought, which of the following animals do you think you could defeat in a closed room with no weapons? And something like, I don't remember now the number, like 4% said gorilla and elephant. And I mean, no human is going to stand a chance against a gorilla or an elephant or a grizzly bear. And so that's the lizard man continent, right? We don't know if those people actually believe that, but presumably it's hard to believe that they do. And yet they answer that way. And that's why I want to go back to that number that I showed you at the very beginning, that 14% of Americans. Do 14% of Americans really believe that? Or is 10% of that the lizard man constant and only 4% of Americans believe that? We don't know. And that's a major challenge with our polling that social psychologists and social scientists have known about for years. They're very aware of all the different biases, but the media is not necessarily as aware of that. And so we often we see media amplification of these statistics that may or may not be as valid as they're made out to be. So I want to talk a bit about how our brains work against us in understanding these things, our cognitive biases. They rely on heuristics, and I'm going to talk about what heuristics are here in a moment. But what's important is that all of us, every single one of us, has cognitive biases. Pushing against them in other people, and sometimes even in ourselves, can lead to a backfire effect where we want to cling to what we already sort of deeply believe. And what I think is really interesting is what is keeping us, what once kept us alive, which is heuristics, is now threatening our health and safety in the form of cognitive biases. Okay, and it still does keep us alive, and I'm going to give an example of that. But first, what are heuristics? They're cognitive shortcuts. If you were to walk into, how many of you, if you think to yourself, if you've ever walked into a grocery store you've never been in before, perhaps in a new place, and you have that feeling of, oh my God, I don't know where anything is, right? You don't know where the toothpaste is, you don't know where the milk is, you're sort of it's sensory overload, right? You're trying to take it all in and you don't even know where to go. You're going to spend 3 times longer in that grocery store trying to find stuff than you would in a place you already know. And that's because you are having to observe, interpret, analyze, assess all the stimuli in that place at that time on the spot with no sort of, no thresholds to hold on to, no anchor points to hold on to. I feel this way. I remember one time I came back from overseas, where I'd been overseas for about a year and a half, and I went into a Walmart. That was a mistake. And I was kind of like, I was dumbstruck, kind of looking around me, and I was like, oh my God, I don't know what to do, because I hadn't been in a Walmart in so long. And heuristics let us skip those parts. It gives us these signal posts. I'm sure all of you have at some point when walking to campus or walking on campus, you have left one class and found yourself at the door of the next class, and you don't remember anything that transpired in the previous 10 minutes. That's because heuristics guided you there. You were able to tune out the world because you know where you're going. Your body knows where you're going. Heuristics are what led us when I'm driving. This is how it saves our lives still. If I'm driving, I'm not paying attention to every tree, every road sign, every single thing I'm seeing while I'm driving. I'm only paying attention to the things that my brain has trained me to pay attention to, so that when I see a ball jump in, fall in the middle of the street, that is what catches my attention, and I can slam the brakes before I even see the kid run out and get that ball. And this was also useful in the forest, where, you couldn't take in everything that was in the forest when we were cave people. You had to be able to zero in on the roar of the lion that was, X, miles away. And I had a personal experience that my husband still makes fun of me for with this. We were in the Amazon, and we were taking a trip, and we were doing a hike in the Amazon, and we were looking through, and I'm all, it's the Amazon. You're hearing monkeys, and there's dewdrops on the things, and there's, vines, and there's ants and all this stuff. And I went to take a step and stopped with my foot still in the air. And I called the guide, and there was a little snake about this big. I found out it was a venomous snake. It was a good thing I didn't step on it. The 2 people ahead of me had stepped right over it and didn't even see it. That was it. I had been in the Amazon 2 days at that point. I had been familiarized enough, but with the sensory overload of the Amazon, for my brain to see that. And I wouldn't have if it had been the very first day I was there. So that's what heuristics are, right? But heuristics turn into cognitive biases. And this is where it gets challenging. So popularity bias is one of these. It's a snowball effect of trending. We've all seen this. Tribalism, which, I hate that term. It's not a very culturally sensitive term, since tribes are not a proper nomenclature for the ways in which different societies gather, but it is the term that we've politically come to use to refer to the way people choose their in-group and stick to their in-group at the expense of facts. There's a feedback loop of polling. When people answer polls, they are sometimes responding with the way they think the pollster wants to hear. That social desirability bias. If you ask a bunch of pregnant women if they drank during pregnancy, you may not get an accurate answer. But they also signal party loyalty or identity and loyalty. So if they, for example, one of my frustrations early in the middle of the pandemic, when the vaccines were not ready yet, but they were in development, you saw all these polls coming out saying, this many people, 40% of people are not going to get the vaccine. Well, there was no vaccine yet. There was no safety data. If someone asked me, are you going to get the vaccine when it comes out? Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen the data. I don't know how effective it is. I don't know how safe it is. How can I possibly give you an accurate answer to that? And yet, saying that 40% of people don't want to get it could signal other people to say, oh, well, I'm not going to get it either. If 40% of people don't want it, that maybe they know something I don't, right? At the same time, a proportion of that 40% probably had every intention of going out and getting the vaccine. I know several people in my own life who are conservative and voted for Trump who were like, I'm not getting that vaccine. And I'm the one who gave them information on how to get the vaccine, because answering that they weren't going to get the vaccine to a pollster was a signal identifier, right? They were signaling their identity in a group, and it had nothing to do with their actual behavior. Okay. Confirmation bias. You guys, a lot of you are probably already familiar with this. You look for the things that already confirm what you already believe. And this is the most dangerous one with the algorithms, because if I type into Google a particular topic that's controversial that I want information on, Google knows who I am really well by now. Google reads my email. Google knows what I want to see. And I have to either open up a incognito browser or go to a different, go to some other, I need to travel in New York City, so I'm not stuck in the Texas IP address, or, I have to be careful about how I get that information, because Google wants me to find stuff I already agree with. And that's very, so it's not only working against yourself, you're working against the algorithms. Anchoring bias. How many of you have, well, here, I'll give you a fun example. I will insist to all of you who learned that Pluto was not a planet, that Pluto is a planet, because I learned that Pluto was a planet when I was in second grade. And that was the first thing I learned. So in my heart, Pluto will always be a planet. That's anchoring bias, right? The first thing that you learn is what you believe, and whether it's supported by scientific fact at that time or not, this is where all your old wives' tales come in, right? How many of you think that if you don't wear a hat when you go outside, you're going to get a cold? Well, there's no actual evidence for that, but that's what we believe because it's the first thing we learned. Framing effect. Boy, we saw this firsthand during the pandemic. If you have a 90% chance of success of a surgery, you're going to sign. If you have a 10% chance of risk of complications, ooh, that seems high, doesn't it? And how many times did you see people say, oh, well, this disease has a 99.9% chance of, a 99.9% chance of survival, which is not an accurate number. But the point is, comparing the death rate to the survival rate, even when it was accurate, really changes how you perceive it, as opposed to saying 1 in X people, which is very different. Because once you say, okay, if you have 1,000 people, 100 of them are going to die. Wow. All of a sudden that becomes more real. Fluency heuristic. This is what all of advertising is based on. The shorter, the simpler, the pithier, the funner, the more easily you're going to believe it, and it's going to stick in your brain. Okay. Nuanced, complicated answers don't stick in our brains and don't make sense to us, but simple answers do. And this is just basic. I mean, this makes sense from a cognitive perspective, but it can become really problematic when we're talking about science. Availability bias. How many of you have ever gone to the beach and your concern was getting running into a shark and getting a shark bite, right? Not everybody, I'm crazy. I go swimming with sharks. But a lot of people, that's their fear. And yet they're far more likely to get sunburned or increase their risk of cancer down the line, to get in a car accident, to get in the undertow and get, under and drown. Those are all far more likely, but those are very mundane things that we don't think about. The scary, dramatic thing, or maybe you read an article recently about a shark attack that happened. That's, it's what your brain goes to first. We see this a lot with vaccines, like, oh my God, vaccines are going to cause autism. We don't think about the fact, it's that these are relying on something that we heard that sounds dramatic, whether true or not. Dunning-Kruger is one of my favorites, and it's actually, it's oversimplified when you hear about Dunning-Kruger. It's this idea that the less you know, the more poorly you assess your own knowledge. The example I give people is that I know just enough Spanish to get myself into trouble, but not enough Spanish to get myself out of trouble. I know some Spanish, but I couldn't tell you how good my Spanish is. I couldn't tell you if my Spanish accent is good because I don't know enough Spanish to assess that accurately. But a lot of people might be, I probably overestimate my French. I think my French is really good when it sucks. I don't know. So the more you know about your field, the more you can competently self-assess. And that's a lot harder to do. A lot of times Dunning-Kruger is thought of as like, you don't know enough to know that you don't know jack. And that's an oversimplification of it. And then there are some flaws with the study by Dr. Dunning and Dr. Kruger that did this, but it's still a useful concept to understand the fact that the less knowledge you have about a topic, the less you can really understand where you fall in terms of your understanding of it. Okay. Those are just a sampling of the biases. I got this off of Wikipedia if you really want to go down the rabbit hole. There's a lot of them, okay? So what can we do about it, right? Those were just a sampling. There's tons more. Well, first of all, what doesn't work is the deficit model. The deficit model is this idea that a person has a deficit of information, a deficit of facts, or has false facts. All we got to do is give them the correct information and voila, it's all going to be better, okay? If that were the case, nobody would be smoking. We would all be slender, fit, athletic people who eschew our, dessert at dinner. There's a lot, none of us would ever have texted while driving ever in our entire lives. I'm sure every single one of you has never looked at your phone while driving, right? Just having facts doesn't mean we're going to behave differently. That's not how it works. And I think this is the biggest mistake that people make, especially on social media when you're trying to push back, is your first instinct is to say, no, that's wrong. Here's the reality. Here's the truth. And that's not going to really do anything. It's not that you can't ever provide facts, but that's not where you start. Okay. One, and I'm going to go through, these are individual things, and then I'm going to expand out to policy discussions on this. So the best way to combat misinformation is first to be able to, go through and sift through information, identify whether or not it's accurate in the first place. So you come to a new claim, stop. What's the source? Where's that? Where are you learning this information? Where else can you find corroboration for that information, right? Look for other coverage, better coverage. Look at, whenever someone sends me something and says, oh my gosh, have you heard about this? The very first thing I do is go to Google, I type it in and I hit news. And then I look at all the headlines and then I start clicking on the stories. And I look at 4 or 5 stories before I even begin to assess whether or not I think it's accurate or if it's been accurately interpreted or anything else. And I try to be very thoughtful about which stories I click on. I do click on the Fox News. I do click on the Wall Street Journal. And I also click on, the Daily Kos. I want to see what different ideological perspectives are on that topic. Then trace those claims and quotes and media to their source. One of the challenges here is with all the deep fakes that we're seeing with video manipulation, it makes it much harder to do that. But you want to find out, if I see a story about a study, I go pull up that study if I can. You don't always have access to it. And I want to read that study. If someone said something in a press conference, I want to go to that press conference and watch the video myself. And I'm going to try and go, to C-SPAN or the official, CNN, whatever's official site was streaming it at the time. All of this idea of SIFT came from Mike Caulfield at Washington State University. He has a great whole article on this if you want to read more about it. Recognize the classic tactics of persuasion. This dates way back to, Plato. Ethos, how credible is the source? Pathos, what role is it playing in invoking emotion? And logos, the factual information. I wrote an article early in the pandemic about the movie Plandemic, which was this documentary filled with misinformation. And as I watched it, I was very impressed because what they did was they alternated between these 3 things. They were using ethos, pathos, and logos to make their arguments, and logos was the worst among them. It was really pulling on pathos and ethos. The logos of it was not factual information, but it was buttressed by, inviting doctors to speak. And the logos was things like taking a Fauci video out of context, for example. Or not providing the date on it. And then, of course, the pathos. Knowing that these are classic methods of persuasion that have worked for literally millennia can help you look for them and assess, okay, I need to pick apart the pathos from the logos so that I can investigate the logos on its own. I need to consider the ethos here. That person sounds credible, but are they credible? Are they authoritative? Are they knowledgeable? What is their experience? Crafting actually, I want to go back for a minute. This can be used for good as well. And I actually saw a brilliant example of using it for good with all 3 of these. There was a bunch of Republican doctors who are in Congress, and they put together a video trying to encourage people to get vaccinated. And a lot of them were wearing white coats. Okay, these congressmen haven't practiced medicine in many, many years, but they wore a white coat because it bumped up that ethos, right? And then they already had the credibility of being GOP senators and representatives that a conservative audience is already going to be more inclined to trust, right? And they touched on some of the very issues that people are worried about, safety, for example. So that was typing into the pathos, and they addressed it with logos. So they weaved all those together. Crafting responses. Your fact-based response is the deficit model. It's not usually effective by itself, but you have to include it at some point, right? You don't just not talk about the facts, but it's just not your first go-to. Your logic-based responses involve fact, right? But they also involve explaining, look at what they did here. Look at how they manipulated this by starting with an anecdote instead of starting with the study. It's talking about logos and ethos and pathos, right? Explaining the scientific method, understanding that science is not a body of knowledge, it's a process of seeking information imperfectly through knowledge, right? The big idea of science, I'm trying to remember what it was, like, I can't remember now, but there's a funny thing. It's like, screw around, see what happens, right? And then screw around again. That's this, science. Source-based responses, working on that ethos, you can reduce the credibility of their source, but you can also bump up the credibility. What if you can find one of the sources that they agree with, like a source that they trust that has accurate information, right? Even if it's a broken clock. Sometimes broken clocks are useful. Empathy-based responses, I would say, are the most effective initially. Point out the targets of whatever the misinformation is and how they're harmed, but also look at where the individual person who has those feelings is coming from. What is their personal experience? Why are they being taken in by this? What are their values? Okay, so this goes into some of the tactics that I use whenever I'm encountering people. And it's interesting because I had a conversation just yesterday with a friend of mine in Egypt who has been very frustrated because a lot of her friends are sort of going down this anti-vaccine rabbit hole. And she was throwing factual information at them and didn't understand why they were getting upset and wanting to unfriend her. And she was very upset by this, understandably. And I talked to her about, here's where you can start. First, you acknowledge and validate their uncertainty and anxiety, right? They're seeking this information out because it's providing some kind of, it's fulfilling a need for them. What is that need? Okay, establish yourself as a trusted source, or if you're not a trusted source, find someone who is. Who is the trusted messenger? An example that I probably shouldn't say on something that is public is I recently had someone in my family that it was important that they get vaccinated, and I did not go to them because they were not going to listen to me, but someone else in the family was who they would listen to. And so that was who I asked to talk to them about it. Listen to what they're saying. And I mean that so genuinely. You have to listen to them and withhold judgment. And sure, in your head, you might be going like, cuckoo, 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 but you got to listen and school your face, practice. Okay. Demonstrate empathy and open-mindedness. You have to be willing to say, okay, I can see what you're saying. You don't have to validate their statements, but you can validate their feelings. Okay. Wow, I understand how scary it must be to consider giving your child a vaccine when you don't know how it's going to affect them. Well, anybody can relate to that. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the vaccine, but you're validating that that's a real fear that has validity. Affirm their intelligence. Nobody likes to be thought of as an idiot, right? How many times have you tried to tell someone I started to say the wrong thing. That's a crappy source. That's a crappy source there. Why are you reading that crap? Well, you just insulted something they consider to be a valid source. Why are they going to listen to you now? You just made them feel stupid. This is especially hard on social media when you're doing it, you're calling them out in front of other people, and their inclination is to save face. I will often say things like, wow, that's an interesting, claim. I hadn't seen that before. I did some digging around myself and I found this. Have you seen this source on it as well? I wonder if this one's more accurate. Well, of course it's more accurate because you're quoting something from a ridiculous site, but I'm not going to say that because I want them to be thought as, oh, they're a thoughtful person who's open-minded enough to look at multiple sources. Okay. And it sounds like I'm being condescending or patronizing, but I'm not. I have learned things from people who have said these. I was on a thread recently where someone suggested that weighted blankets were dangerous for children to sleep with. And my children sleep with a weighted blanket. And I questioned that because I hadn't seen it. And they came back and said, well, check out this link. And I went and checked it out. And I'm now reconsidering whether or not that was, whether or not what I had thought was accurate or not. So I love to tell people when I'm wrong, both on Twitter and on Facebook. I will frequently say, hey guys, guess what? I was wrong today. It's a great day because I learned something. I try and model that there is a value in being wrong and changing your mind. Always avoid mockery, shaming, dismissiveness. They just don't work. Okay. Sandwich your facts between affirmation and validation strategies. And the Socratic method. If you're not familiar with the Socratic method, Google it. It's basically asking questions over and over and over. And they're leading questions. And what you want is to lead that person into questioning the things that they need to question. And it doesn't mean questioning themselves, necessarily, but getting them to say, well, why do you believe that? And where did you learn that? And what makes that person credible? And, you want to do it carefully, but you want to lead them into making these discoveries on their own. Okay. So all throughout this, you're encouraging questioning, you're encouraging critical thinking. Do I recognize the news organization that posted this? Is the information seem believable? Does it pass the smell test? Is it written in a style that I would expect from a professional news organization? Is it politically motivated? And my goodness, what is not politically motivated these days, it feels like, right? Now, here's where we get into the dicier stuff. Everything I just covered that's all one-on-one, right? That's in your own circles. And we can all do that, but that is not scalable. Right? You can do it within subgroups and subcultures, but it's not scalable. And this is where it gets challenging. This map shows you where a lot of different countries are working on action against misinformation. I got this from Pointer. If you want to go through and find this and Google it, I'll have a link at the end. So people recognize that this is a global security threat, right? It's a threat to our livelihoods, but it's really hard to scale this up. So I'm going to discuss some of the opportunities we have in public policy. And I offer lots of caveats with this, because what I'm going to leave with you with later on is you guys are the undergraduates. Our lives are in your hands, no pressure. Okay. We have left you a steaming pile of crap and we need you to clean it up. And I am so sorry for that. If it makes you feel better, I had to clean up the baby boomers crap. That is the way it seems these days. But so here are some things that can do. First, digital literacy campaigns. That is something that can happen. And that sounds like propaganda, but just making opportunities. This can happen at the hyper-local level all the way up to the national level, helping people understand digital literacy. There are some fantastic web pages at the NIH that go through how to evaluate health websites, for example. Just type in how to evaluate health website, and the NIH is the first one that comes up and tells you here's what you look for. Okay. Incorporating epistemology into curricula. Epistemology is the study of how do we know what we know? How do you know that what you know is true? And how do you know that your conviction is valid? And this gets tricky because if it's done not carefully, you could lead someone to say, well, I'm going to do my own research. I don't trust you guys. I mean, it can go the other way really bad, really fast. But I do think we need to spend more time in this digital era thinking about how we know what we know and how we know that those sources are valid and why we believe those. And that taps into, the nature of knowledge and consciousness and sources and I mean, everything that I've been talking about up until now sort of goes into that. It's a branch of philosophy. I mean, but if you ever have an opportunity to take a class in epistemology as an elective, I strongly recommend it. The two classes I wish I had taken when I was an undergrad now, looking back, were biostatistics or statistics and epistemology. Those are the two that I would recommend to everybody. Heed the risks of overregulation, right? Governments can't solve all these problems. This is a massive problem, and governments can actually exploit them and make them worse, as we have seen with Russia, for example. And so we have to keep in mind that public policy has a place, but it's not going to be the solution, and it shouldn't be the solution. But things that we can do in public policy: increase workforce diversity. The more diverse people we have in positions of power, the more likely we are to consider all the different stakeholders that are involved. And when we don't have certain groups represented, they get left out. They're not considered. And then we have no way of addressing their needs. And this includes not just ethnicity or sexuality or identity, it includes ideological, religious, political diversity. Now, I'm not saying that you need a Holocaust denier on your panel. I mean, you have to be reasonable here, but diversity is absolutely vital to our success in public policy. Funding research on disinformation and effective interventions. We have a huge knowledge gap here. I mean, a huge knowledge gap. We really don't know a lot, not nearly as much as we need to. And then respect the First Amendment. I've added here the fourth is a lost cause. I was talking with a lawyer friend yesterday about when I can't remember in my lifetime, when did we have a Fourth Amendment? And I've just decided the Fourth Amendment, if you're not up to date on your amendments, is the right to privacy. And other than Roe versus Wade in 1973, which was before I was born, I'm not sure that our right to privacy has any, it's been shredded. That's long gone. But we still have the First Amendment and we must protect it. And that goes on to this next one. Public policy can support journalism. Now, obviously, I'm a journalist. I have a vested interest in telling, public policymakers to support me. But I do believe that supporting investigative and hyperlocal journalism are utterly essential to, knowledge is power, right? Educating people is power. Investigative journalism costs money. Hyperlocal journalism, not only has this been exploited by when we have a lot of papers that have gone out of business and pseudoscience or pseudo papers fill the gap and provide misinformation, we also know that people trust those who are closest to them, physically, emotionally, mentally, geographically. So we need to have hyperlocal journalism funded adequately. And right now it is a really depressing state of affairs. We need to support the news gathering process, open record laws, allowing journalists to be safe in covering protests. I don't need to tell you what happened last summer. You can all go back and look at YouTube and find that for yourself. We also need to beef up legislation, detection, enforcement, and consequences of online harassment, stalking, and doxing. And that's why I gave you that number at the beginning, that 1,463, the number of people I had to block. I spent 4 hours blocking those people. Imagine, I actually tweeted shortly after that, I want to be able to go onto Twitter and there's certain keywords in bios that I could use. And oh my gosh, if I could block everybody that has hashtag MAGA, do you know how much quieter my social media experience would be? It'd be very quiet comparatively, not to mention a bunch of others I could provide. So, but Twitter hasn't given me that opportunity. And so in the meantime, if the consequences for cyberbullying and doxing and online harassment are great enough and substantially, are thoughtfully executed, then at least that gives a measure of protection to our truth tellers, right? And I don't mean truth tellers just in the form of journalists. I mean any truth teller, whistleblowers, anything, right? And not to over-regulate journalism. This gets really dicey because we have this contradictory situation where we need people to be able to share information that is being covered up. But then we have the people who say, oh, this is a cover up and it's not really, right? But I have seen some people who have, with good intentions, tried to say, okay, we're going to credential journalists. Well, how on earth do you credential a journalist? I mean, journalism is, by its nature, it was scrappy muckrakers in the beginning who were telling truth to power. Like the very essence of my industry is sort of contrary to this idea of credentialism, which is really challenging. Tech industry opportunities. So if any of you know where Jack Dorsey lives and you know how to sneak into his house and hold a gun to his head, here's what I would tell him to do. Zuckerberg's a lost cause. That dude is just, yeah. Refine and overhaul our algorithms. Algorithms optimize for something. What are they optimizing for? And is it what we want them optimizing for? Have you ever gone to YouTube and try this sometime? Go to YouTube, watch a video, click the first related video. And every time after that, keep clicking it. You will end up in a very deep rabbit hole because the way YouTube algorithm works is it gets narrower and narrower and narrower. And all of a sudden you were watching this National Geographic thing on sharks and you're suddenly reading about people who pretend like they're sharks at furry conventions. I mean, it's like, it goes really crazy. So what are these algorithms, going for? Improve in technology for identifying inaccurate information. Facebook has made an attempt at this and they have failed miserably. I cannot tell you how many friends of mine have been blocked for sharing like a cat picture and it had the word pussy in it. And all of a sudden they're on, they're suspended for 2 days. I mean, there's all kinds of issues and I know they're trying, but they're failing miserably. Increasing, again, workforce diversity. I can't overemphasize this enough. And then we've got deplatforming, which I'm going to get to in the next slide. And I know I'm running low on time here, so I'm going to wrap this up quickly. We need data, and the tech industry can give us data. What is the situation on the ground? What works to stop it? What's effective? What's not effective? Who are we even dealing with? Okay, here's who we're dealing with. This is a case study of the disinformation dozen, okay? 12 people who account for up to 73% of Facebook's anti-vaccine content. 73%, and most of them are still active on Facebook. And this has been published for some time now, so Zuck has had plenty of time to kick their butts off, okay? Up to 17% of anti-vaccine tweets feature these folks. Here they are. One of these people, I have their cell phone number. I'm not gonna tell you which one. Actually, no, 2 of these people, I have their cell phone number. I've interviewed two of these people. They're quite interesting. But these are the bad guys. Okay, these people have immense power. Immense power. And some of these names you'll recognize, some of these names you won't recognize. But when you go and look for their names, you'll be like, oh, they're the ones behind this. You'll recognize their handiwork. Trust me. Some of their organizations are down below here. But this, deplatforming these individuals, imagine erasing in an instant 73% of all anti-vaccine information on Facebook. All you got to do is ban 12 people. That's all it takes. That's kind of mind-blowing. I mean, that's not going to solve all our problems. This is one tiny issue, anti-vaccine issues. And this is, one social media network. But the point, I think, is clear there. So why bother? This is my final slide. Well, my almost final slide. Why should we bother spending our time here? Well, other than, I think I've given you plenty of reasons why, because we don't want to go extinct and this is going to be the end of us. But misinformation and disinformation, it's harmful to everybody, the community at large, to individuals, and unchecked misinformation keeps spreading. It just keeps going. It's like the Energizer Bunny. If you guys remember that, boom, 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 boom. It just keeps going. It never stops. Addressing false information erodes the bystander effect. It inspires others. When others see you speak up, then they are willing to speak up. The bystander effect is that idea where you get mugged on the subway and everyone's like, oh, somebody else will handle it. I'm not going to do anything, right? Interestingly, after 9/11, that changed in New York City. A lot of people were more willing to do things because they'd sort of been through that together. So if you can be the first person to stand up, then it inspires others. And then you can model for them how it's done. You don't just drop a fact and run, right? You try and engage with the person respectfully, and you got to cut your losses. You got to recognize what battles you can win and lose. You got to realize, you got to look out for your own emotional health, right? The mere exposure effect. The more you speak up, the more it normalizes factual information. The more you hear something repeated, the more familiar it is. The more familiar it is, the less threatening it is. The less threatening it is, the more you're likely to engage with it and think about it. So just being exposed to it over, and that works both ways, obviously, but you can be a force for good, right? Use the force. Explaining how the scientific process works and reinforces it. So these are what, this is my plea to you guys, that don't throw your hands up in the air. Actually engage with that crazy uncle that you only see 3 times, a decade or something. Okay. I have a couple resources here that I can share later. This is the slide I normally end with. Almost all of my talks end with never give up. Our lives depend on it. Last night, in a fit of whatever, I added a slide. So I'm sorry in advance for ending on this note. I firmly believe that the 2 biggest global threats to humanity are climate change and disinformation. I just don't know which one's going to cause our extinction first. And I know that is a really dark note to end on, but I think we're there. I really think we're there. And I think we need to take this threat that seriously. And of course, those are not independent of one another, right? Disinformation and climate change are related. But I think we really need to recognize what a tremendous existential threat this is to every aspect of our lives. And I will end there so that we can move on. I know I'm running a little bit over. My apologies for that. But we'll go ahead and move, I guess, to the question and answers. Yes, I don't know how this, I forget who goes on next.
Yes. Oh my goodness, Ms. Haley, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. Really incredible. I learned a lot. But at this point, I would like to introduce my fellow classmates who are joining me: Alexandra Morales, Andrea Raya, Brian Ho, Camila Pollard, Kevin Karami, and Ujman Alawi Ismaili. They will be able to pose questions directly to you, Ms. Haley. I will also be posing questions we receive from our audience members. So I would just like to take this time and give a quick reminder to those in our audience to please submit your questions via the Q&A box instead of the chat box. But with that being said, we do have a question from our audience that I think would be great to get us going. So Sergio asked, what would you say is the effect of not teaching our true history, detailed slavery and colonization accounts included, in schools has on our likelihood of being mis- or disinformed?
It has a tremendous effect. And it goes right back to that anchoring bias that I talked about, right? The first thing you learned is what you believe. We've seen that in action with the, the 1619 Project, where the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who, spearheaded that project has suffered. She actually was just denied tenure, for one thing, which is just criminal in my opinion. But, she has suffered a lot of abuse because no one wanted to hear that that was the accurate information. And you hear all the time that those who do not remember history are destined to repeat it. I think we're destined to repeat it anyway. I used to be an optimist. I still do think I'm an optimist, but I'm a cynical optimist. And I don't think that just knowing our history is enough to stop us from repeating it. But I think we also can't know where to go from here without knowing our history. I think knowing our history is utterly fundamental to understanding where we need to go. And an example of a way in which it's so essential to public policy, and I'll use this example here. Not only do we need to think about, well, actually, I'm going to use two examples from here. One that I was going to say is knowing not only about the horrors of slavery and the realities associated with those and with our founding fathers' role in those, but also the science of generational trauma and how where people started in slavery has led to where they are today. If you don't have a really good understanding of that historical trajectory along the way, not just the beginning and the end, but the middle, then the idea of reparations sounds crazy to you. Why am I going to give you money for, your great, 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 great grandfather who was like beat up by my great, 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 great grandfather's mother or something? It sounds crazy. But when you understand what redlining is, where people were denied the opportunity to get into to purchase homes in neighborhoods that had better education, for example, and the generational impacts of that over time, or even the scientific generational impacts of the telomeres in our brains. Just Google, generational trauma telomeres sometime, and you'll know what I'm talking about there. Or, the way in which our actual genes are changed by experience and is then passed down to others. This is a very new area of science that we didn't even know about before. But another example of this that I heard recently, I attended a talk at the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, where they were talking about, we know that today maternal morbidity and maternal mortality is more than twice as high for Black mothers, and infant mortality is more than twice as high for Black infants than it is for white and Latino. Okay. Why is that? You got to go all the way back. Do you know what happened when the slave trade ended, but slavery continued? The slave trade ended, slavery continued. Where are you going to get new slaves? Women became breeders. They actually got better medical care sometimes than others did because they were breeders. It was husbandry. They were livestock, and it was time for them to breed. And when it makes sense when I think about it, but my God, it's horrid. Like just saying those words just curls my toes because it's so horrific. But when you think about what happened, and then once slavery was over, there was no advantage to that. And then you had segregation, and, Black women could only rely on midwives. And the midwives were the grannies who, from the slave days, learned the, childbirth. And then were able to take care of them, but they didn't have access to the modern medicine that white women were getting access to. And all of this, I'm not going to go through the whole history. There's a fabulous paper out there about all this. When you trace what each subsequent generation affected, and then you look at where we are now, well, no wonder we have higher asthma rates in Black children. No wonder we have higher infant mortality. No wonder we have higher diabetes. All of those things trace all the way back to the slave days. So if we don't know what those problems are from 400 years ago, we can't begin to solve them because we're not thinking about what the genuine causes are. We're only putting a Band-Aid on it. So I know that was a very long answer, but hopefully it touches on that.
A wonderful answer, though. Thank you so much. In fact, Sergio just responded. Wow, amazing answer. Thank you so much for all your hard work. Feeling inspired. I have to agree with that. I would like to turn to our panelist, Kevin.
Thanks, Maddie. And thank you, Ms. Haley, for one of the most informative and eye-opening presentations I've ever been a part of. I think this is a topic that gets mentioned a lot, but rarely is it as in-depth and as holistic as the way you presented it. So it was really amazing.
Thank you.
What I wanted to ask was a bit of a general question, but I think it's really important because I think it's getting at the core of what you're trying to say. Would you say that the core issue here, or maybe one of the core issues, is this lack of individuals wanting to understand one another, and this kind of, this desire to not want to understand someone else's position on something kind of drives them to go to these extremes where they, almost there's almost this pressure that they can't be wrong and they have to be right. And I think that maybe social media and even traditional media has maybe like amplified this effect where, you don't want to be seen as the bad guy or the wrong one on social media. And this kind of drives people to these extremes, and they'll subscribe to, conspiracy theories, or they'll believe in disinformation because they don't want to understand, other people. Do you think that has like this lack of understanding plays a role in it?
Lack of understanding plays a role in it, but I would actually flip what you said. I think it's the opposite. Honestly, I think it's the exact opposite. And what I mean by that is what you just suggested was that it's a not wanting to understand people and a wanting to be right and not want to look at the good information. I think it's the exact opposite. We want to be connected to other people. We need to be connected to other people, and we need to feel secure in those relationships. We need to feel like we belong to a group and that group has our back when something goes wrong. We need to understand our world. And so I think it's not so much that people don't want to understand, it's that they want to understand so desperately that they will cling to whatever they can find. So it's almost, it's not, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just flipping it on its head. And we live in incredibly tumultuous, uncertain times. Look at the threat of climate change. There are a lot of people out there who, look at farmers, right? Farmers cannot deny climate change. They deal with it every day. Yet if you were to do a survey of them, a lot of them are going to say they don't believe that man had an impact on it. I just finished the book, The Four Winds by Hannah, Hannah, the last name is escaping me. And it's about it takes place in the Great Depression. And one of the things that I didn't know that was interesting as I'm reading about the Dust Bowl, which is literally only about 200 miles north of me, I knew about the Dust Bowl. I read the Grapes of Wrath. I knew about the Great Depression. I did not realize the extent to which farming practices of the time led to the Dust Bowl. The fact that tilling all the fields, getting rid of all the natural grasses, laying down wheat. Once they used up all the nutrients, there was no more grasses, so that when the drought came and dried up the topsoil, there were no grasses to anchor it. And it turned into these massive dust storms, like storms that would turn the sky black. And I had no idea about that. And it was really hard for the Public Works Administration and Roosevelt's administration to convince the farmers to say, I'm going to pay you $0.10 per acre. We're going to pay you not to plant because we need it to recover. And no offense, but you guys did this. It's not your fault that you did this, but you did this, right? Who wants to know that they're responsible for their own, destruction of their own livelihood? It's going to be, that's a tough pill to swallow, right? And so it took a lot of convincing to get them to that point to accept that. And I think we see the same idea today. Who wants to think that something that they might have done could have caused harm to themselves or someone they love, right? So I don't think it's that people don't want to know correct information. I do think there's definitely an element of not wanting to be wrong, but it's not wanting to be wrong because it's hard to be wrong, right? It's hard to take responsibility for being wrong. It's one of the reasons I like to model it for people all the time. It's a tough pill to swallow. Regret's not fun, and so I think our desire and our need as social human beings to understand our world and each other and connect, that's what leads to the tribalism. That's what leads to the, latching on to some of these conspiracy theories. So I think your idea was in the right area, but on its head, basically.
Wonderful. I would like to go back. We have another audience question from Luis. Social media companies operate on business models that incentivize growth, increased user management, and large-scale data collection in order to sell highly targeted ads. Is there any alternative business model not based on those three things that could have a positive impact in terms of mitigating disinformation?
I will say this is a little outside my wheelhouse. I don't know as much about the tech stuff and the financial sector. The first thing to come to mind, we have the same problem in journalism, actually, not just in social media, but in traditional media. Traditional media the bread and butter continues to be ad driven. And that is problematic in many ways. A lot of traditional media still have their sacred cows. They get money from such and such a place, and so they're not going to attack that place. But the only thing that comes to mind is the same thing that comes to mind for media, which is you've either got public funding, which I do not think is a good idea for tech, because I do think it'll stifle innovation. And I think you run into issues with First Amendment issues. I think it can lead to concerns about public works and public utilities. Does the social media then become a public utility? I've heard people try to argue that Facebook is a public utility. I think that's a red herring. I don't think I think that's a fallacious argument. But so I don't think it should be public, which is something that can work for journalism at least. But the only other thing I can think of is subscription-based models. And the problem with subscription-based models is that you automatically privilege the privileged, right? You've now made this a financial barrier of some form. Even if you try and make it a smaller entry level, you've still, with the wealth inequalities that we have, that becomes problematic. So I wish I had a good answer. My answer is I don't know, but we need an answer. So that's your guys' job. You guys got to figure that out.
Perfect. Thank you for your honesty. I'd love to turn back to a student panelist. Andrea, I believe you have a question.
Yes, I did. But first, I did want to thank you for that presentation. Personally, I can relate. My dad, he's denying he does not want to get vaccinated. But I'm gonna take some of your tips and hopefully take a calm approach to it and try to convince him at least somehow. Because I understand I have some family members who do not want to get vaccinated too.
Totally understand. I do too. We all do.
But I did want to ask, because unfortunately my father, he does not have education at all. His sources is friends from work who all use Facebook, of course. That's his only source of information. But I have seen studies that say supposedly education levels do influence like your voting behavior or like political behavior. Do you have any thoughts on that, or do you agree with that?
I do think that you see lots of correlations. What accounts for those correlations is hard to know, because you've got reverse causation that can be working there. Is the person who got a PhD more likely to vote Democrat because of the education they received, or because they grew up in a house that had the means to send them and inspired them to study something that would lead them to get a PhD? I don't know, right? I mean, there's no question about the correlations. The correlations are there in terms of education and political ideology. I don't know if we have a strong handle. I think there are times when it works both ways. I've definitely seen in my own life people who and my own personal life, my own experiences. I mean, I can think of educational experiences I had that definitely changed my perspective on things once I learned more about them. So I whether or not what that means is also my question. Like, okay, so we know there's this correlation. Even if we have that knowledge of causation, what does that mean? Does that mean that we should, incentivize or provide more support to certain groups to get an education? And what does that mean? And what kind of education? And how much, we already have a belief among some conservative circles that, colleges are these liberal, I don't know what you call it, a liberal sort of breeding ground for dangerous communist ideas. So what do we do? And there's plenty of very intelligent, highly educated people, Stephen Miller, who are, complete bigots and dangerous. So, I mean, yes, there are correlations. What does it mean? I don't know. And I think one thing that's important to point out here is that the correlations for that are not as strong when it comes to believing pseudoscience and vaccines. There's not great correlation between, for example, being anti-vaccine and having a good education. I can point to just as many people with PhDs who are anti-vaccine as I can high school graduates. And I recently wrote an article in Texas Monthly about a woman who I do not think went to college, who fell into sort of the anti-vaccine world, became an influencer, and then over a period of a year and a half discovered she was wrong, and now is a pro-vaccine advocate. And she's not some brilliant genius. She's not dumb, but she's not an Einstein. And I don't believe that if she's been to college, I didn't discuss it with her. But my point is, it works. There's not an easy correlation to be made there.
Great question. And yes, I also have heard that thought that colleges or higher education is, yes.
Ground.
I think we've all heard that. I would now love to turn to Alexandra.
Yes, I would also like to say, Ms. Haley, it was a really good presentation and very enjoyable. So my question is specific to the COVID vaccine and the fact that we're seeing slowing vaccination rates. So I was just wondering, do you attribute that to misinformation and conspiracy theories that's going to have a lasting impact on the vaccine? Or do you think it's just a lack of information to the public or trust of the CDC and government that will come with time?
All of the above and then some. The one you left out was access. We definitely, misinformation is playing a role in the uptake. I think that is a part of it. I think there's a natural and not wrong hesitancy on some people to say, listen, I want to understand this better. And when I say access, I mean access to the vaccine, but I mean access to good information. It takes time to go look up what the side effects are. It takes time to read those and think about them and then decide, is this website trustworthy? Can I trust this? That all takes time, and not everybody has that time. Especially people who are working 2 jobs or who are in an hourly wage job where they don't have a salary and they have no way of taking sick leave, or they want the vaccine, but they can't afford to take off work if they have, everyone's heard that the second shot, you can knock you flat and you can end in bed for a day and a half with a fever, right? Well, for some people, that's no big deal. For other people, that's a day's worth of wages lost. I don't think we have done enough outreach to different communities that have concerns, legitimate concerns about vaccines. People who have a history of distrusting the government or the medical establishment for a long list of reasons. The popular one that we reach out to is the Black community with the history of Tuskegee, but it's not just that. I mean, Latino populations have lots of reasons to mistrust authority. We look at the last 4 years of policy before the current administration and how they were treated. We know that, people who are in rural areas, not only may they have limited access to the information or a doctor who can answer their questions that they can trust, but they might have to drive 20 miles to find the nearest place. And what if they don't have public transportation and they don't have their own transportation? So I think all of these issues play into it. And I think certainly hesitancy is a concern, and certainly misinformation is a concern. I'm not going to say they're not. I've spent the last 10 years of my life writing about vaccine misinformation, but I think there's much, much more to that problem that we're not giving enough attention to, including access. The distrust of the government certainly plays a role. I think we've started to repair some of that damage. I don't know if the CDC will ever return to the way it was viewed before 2020. Which is incredibly depressing for me to say. The damage that was done to our public health infrastructure and our public communication, the politicization of basic health measures, the fact that people will walk around and say, I'm going to wear a mask so they don't think I'm Republican, which I get the joke there, but I mean, think about what that means, So I think all of that plays a role, and the way it all interacts is something we need to better understand, but we need to better understand it with an open mind and in good faith, because a lot of people are offering out these hot takes. I've seen countless articles of someone on, Vox or Quartz or The Atlantic saying, why are people not doing vaccinations? I went to Twitter and asked, here's what 15 people told me. Well, good for you. Have you read the 15 different people who have been researching this for a decade who can tell you actual evidence-based information on this? Or do you just think you're special that you can go to Twitter and figure it out in 15 minutes? I think we have far too many of those hot takes and people not really digging down into the evidence or seeking new evidence related specifically to this vaccine and this time and place.
I think you made a great point about all the damage that's been done this past year. And I think only time will tell, but I agree. I don't think it looks good. I don't know how we get out of this. I actually have a question. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has made the news for many times.
Green with an E, mind you. Sorry, go on.
And I'm just curious if you think, her role in Congress or even her place in Congress increases the threat of disinformation that we,
Absolutely. No question. And I don't think we can, there's not like a public censure way to address that. It's more like, yo, GOP, come get your people. I don't know how many people watching this are Republican. I'm just going to say right now that I think the most dangerous person alive in the United States is Mitch McConnell. He has not, at no point, at least people, Ted Cruz is a close second there, but, and he's my senator. McConnell has no convictions. And I'm not just saying this to be mean. Like, there's plenty of interviews out there. He doesn't have convictions. I mean, at least people like Ron Paul do what they're doing because they believe it. I suspect Green believes what she's doing too and thinks that she's doing good for people. Mitch McConnell has no loyalty to anyone but himself. All his only loyalty is to win. That's all he cares about, is winning. And that is, I mean, I didn't like Antonin Scalia, but the man believed what he believed, and he had a philosophical underpinning to it, at least, right? Now we've got, rapist and whatever. So I'm sorry, I'm finally venturing in directions I shouldn't, right? This is where the filter's coming off. It's Friday afternoon. But my point is, yes, I do think that she's a danger. I don't think she's the only one, but I think it's a problem that can only be solved by her own party. And I don't know what the solution to that is, because I have seen people try. I saw, we saw John McCain try. We saw Jeff Flake try. We saw, oh my gosh, the other McCain, that was just deplatformed, right? She was just removed as the majority leader, I think. It's going to get to a point where the party either undergoes a revolution, implodes. I don't know. You know that when you corner a wild animal, that's when they lash out the most. And I think we are seeing some of that right now, because the numbers are not on the GOP's side. And I don't know what that means. And I'm as curious as you to find out, and probably as frightened as you are to find out. And I'm the one who lives in Texas. I don't even live in California. So
Thank you so much. And I believe Liz Cheney was probably who you were.
Cheney, I was mixing.
Right.
I thank you, Liz Cheney. I said McCain because I was McCain, Cheney. You know where I did there. Okay.
I get it.
Liz Cheney is who I was thinking of. I don't know why I said McCain. Yeah, Liz Cheney.
No
That's
worries.
exactly what I was thinking of. Thank you.
No, but thank you for your thoughts. And again, only time will tell with that as well. A lot's going on, and it makes the news or the news I read almost every day.
Trump did not create Trumpism. I mean, it gave a name to it, but it was there. It's been building for years in different ways. There are some key milestones along the way. I would say that the government shut down in '96 with Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton was one of those. I would say that even the deregulation of media under Reagan was one of those. Heck, the Southern Strategy under Nixon was one of those, right? There's all these different markers along the way. I think Sarah Palin as a vice presidential candidate was one of those. That trajectory has been building over time. Trumpism did not originate with Trump, but I do think Trump was the Rubicon. And I don't know what happened. I don't think we can get back across that river. I don't know what's going to happen now. I don't know how we come back from that.
I feel like I could talk to you forever, but I have to pass it on. I know Camila has a question. So Camila, please go ahead.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you, Ms. Haley. This has been a long discussion that's been needing to happen. So just thank you for everything. I wanted to know, how do you envision a future without disinformation? Like, how will it look like, and would it be feasible with the tips that you provided?
There is no future without disinformation. There will always be a motivation for people in power to promote disinformation. It's been around. I mean, I am sure that at some point during like the hunting parties and the hunting and gathering days, one of the tribes said, "Look, mammoth over there," and everyone ran over there, and then he ran and got the real mammoth that was over here. Like, I mean, it's been with us since. I mean, it's always been with us. It always will be with us. I think what's different now is the beast is larger, more dangerous, and easier to wrangle in some ways. And it is so much more tied up with money and power. The more money and power you have, I mean, look at the Koch brothers and their influence over, fake grassroots, your AstroTurf organizations. And that's not, I'm sure there are ones on the left as well. I mean, if you believe the conspiracy theories, like, Gates and Soros are all in behind it. But the point is that for better or for worse, money influences our policy, money influences our access and our information in so many ways. I mean, look at Zuckerberg. He has tremendous power. And we could spend a whole, day or weekend or week discussing how he's wielding it and how he isn't and what he needs to be doing. So we're not ever going to live in a world, a post-disinformation world. The question is, how do we learn to live in the threat that we have now and put in place the safeguards we need to mitigate that damage as much as possible? And that's going to require public policy, individual, social, and technological roles. Lots of different institutions are going to have to play a role in that, and some of them are going to have to work together, and some of them may not. Especially if they're at odds with one another. I don't know what that's kind of why I feel bad, because I'm kind of like, here guys, there's a steaming pile of elephant dung for you to dig through. Good luck with that. Don't fall in. I feel bad. But I mean, every generation inherits the bounty and the negative legacy of the previous one. So so it goes the circle of life. And I am excited. I will say this much. I used to teach high school, and I taught for college for a while. I'm not teaching at the moment, but I have always been inspired by my students, whether they were ninth graders in a town in Texas, or they were college students in journalism, or they were adults that were out taking photos. I've always been inspired by my students. And I see my kids now, they're 7 and almost 11, and what they're learning, and the ingenuity, the optimism, the willingness to take on the big questions, the savviness, the media literacy, all of it's inspiring. So, I mean, as pessimistic as I sound about the challenges that we face, I couldn't ask for a better crop of an army coming up to face it. I'm not just saying that. I really believe that. I mean, look at Stonewall, what do you call it? The teens that were at the Florida high school that was that had the mass shooting, and the influence that they had in centering the gun discussion, right? The firearm policies. So I just think that we do have hope. It's just going to be a lot of hard work. And you guys will be pulling the heaviest load of it. Sorry, I keep apologizing. I'm so sorry.
No, but I think that's one reason why so many of us, or all of us, are in public policy. I think that is a part of it for sure. I'd love to turn to Brian to ask his question.
Thank you, Maddie. And also thank you, Ms. Haley, for the amazing presentation. And I could personally say I've taken many media and cultural studies classes, and I haven't had any discussion to this extent within mis and disinformation. So it's been quite informative. My question is centered towards also a more situation-based, and also for the students of UCR and students everywhere. I would say many times, almost everyone we see ourselves in situations that we can't really get out of. And right now I'm currently speaking about when we're talking about topics of contradicting viewpoints. And I know you elicited some of the points that could be brought up to kind of steer away from, I would say, like aggression, as well as getting hot-headed, quote unquote. But what happens if the situation is unavoidable, where you can't really get to the other person can't get to you, and you have to disengage? What are your tips to kind of disengaging in this kind of situation, as well as kind of steering the conversation away from getting aggressive and to not valuable anymore, I would say?
Excellent question. It taps into self-care, which I think is really important. It's taken me years to learn. I spent, like I said, 4 hours yesterday blocking people. There was a point in time when I would have muted a lot of them, looked at their feed to see if they were worth muting or whatever. Oh no, last night I was like, tap, click, block, confirm, tap, click, block, confirm. I just went on through. I wouldn't have done that 5 years ago. I got to that point now. You have to pick your battles. And that means that I mean that in multiple ways. One, pick the Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or Slack, conversations you're going to engage in, right? Assess, what do I know about this person? Where is this likely to go? I see lots of misinformation on my Facebook feed that I don't touch. It's not worth the engagement, right? Who are you engaging for? Are you engaging for that other person or for the lurkers? There are times I respond to something on Twitter, not because I think that person's going to believe, maybe because there's a lot of other people watching and they'll see that interaction. And they'll also see me then leave it while that person goes ranting and raving and calling me names and I'm not responding, right? Think about what you value in the relationship. My father and I do not see eye to eye on a lot of information. And there are certain topics we have just decided we will not talk about at family dinners, right? And there are some that we will. And I try to respect the difference between where we differ on values and where we differ on beliefs. I'll say, Dad, I do not share your value of X, but because you have that value, I think you ought to know this. So for example, he is a veteran and he believes very strongly in veteran, the need to better support veterans. And I agree with that as well. But he also gets really upset at, for example, football players who kneel during the anthem or something. And I'll say, listen, Dad, I know that you value the role that you played in defending our country, and what you were defending was the value of free speech. You don't have to agree with that speech, and that's okay. You can hate Colin Kaepernick to your heart's delight, but I think you need to recognize at least that one of the things that you were fighting for was the right of him to do that. And isn't it good that we at least live in a society where we have that right, thanks to what you and your colleagues did, right? So I think you have to think about, I love my father. I don't want to get into political arguments with him all the time. There are times when an argument might threaten something directly, personally. Like if my father was not he did get vaccinated, but if he wasn't going to get vaccinated, I would want to have that conversation. And I would want to recognize that nobody changes their mind in a day about a really deeply held belief, right? Think of people's beliefs about medical interventions as similar to something like religion. Nobody loses their religion in a day. Nobody converts to a new religion in a day, right? It can take months, it can take years. People who leave cults might take 2 or 3 years to leave the cult. And the anti-vaccine universe is very much like a cult. So, when you have to give people space to sit with what you say, and then come back to it at a different time. You want to pick your moments to do that, right? There are times on Facebook where I will see a family member who shares a piece of information that's not accurate. And I'll decide, okay, I'm going to leave information that's accurate for them and for anyone else, but here's how I'm going to do it. I thought that too, or I've heard that from some other people and I looked into it and I actually found this. So I don't think that information is accurate. I'm just going to leave this here if you're interested. If they reply to it, I ignore it. I'm not going to engage. I'm not going to go back. So it's an ongoing process. I don't think there's hard and fast rules. You have to follow your gut sometimes. You got to follow your heart sometimes. You got to follow your brain sometimes. And those are 3 different things. When they're all aligned, great, but that doesn't happen very often. And there are going to be times when you have to evaluate, is this a person who I still need in my life? I mean, that's a painful experience. And I have friends who have cut their parents off. I cut someone out of my life very early. I cut someone out of my life in 2016 because of who they voted for. And I have not interacted with them since then. And it was someone I had known for most of my life, since my birth, literally. And so I didn't cut everyone out of my life who made that same voting choice. There's different reasons I had for different people. And none of those are easy questions. I mean, your question's a very good one, but there aren't easy answers to it. And I think all of us need to sort of fumble and stumble our way toward those answers. And a lot of them we're going to learn the hard way.
Thanks, Brian. I think that was a great question and a great question to end with, because unfortunately that is all the time we have for questions. Thank you again, Ms. Haley, for your presentation and for answering all of our questions as well as the audience's questions. And thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar. You can learn more about UCR School of Public Policy events like this by visiting spp.ucr.edu. You can also learn about our new forthcoming BA MPP program launching fall 2022 on our website. We look forward to seeing you at future SPP events. Until then, goodbye.